Are you a seven-figure practice owner that wants to do more without burning out? Join us for the Seven-Figure Practice Retreat, a luxury mastermind where high-level practice owners step away from the day-to-day to build systems, strategy, and freedom in the Dominican Republic. This February, spots are limited, so apply now, and our sponsors are covering 95% of the cost over at practiceofthepractice.com/7. Again, that's practiceofthepractice.com/7. This is the Practice of the Practice podcast. I've done this 1,200 times and I screwed it up. Here we go. This is the Practice of the Practice podcast with Joe Sanak, session number 1,271. I'm Joe Sanak, your host, and welcome to the Practice of the Practice podcast. You know, I am glad Elizabeth left that in so you can just see that, you know, none of us are perfect, that as we continue down this path of just investigating what it means to be human, what it means to be a therapist, what it means to have a thriving practice we absolutely love, we all screw up. And to me, it's important to just leave that in there. In the same way that early podcasts, I would always leave my coffee on the other side of the room because I would record those in my old counseling office, and my podcast stuff was in one corner and my coffee was always in a different spot. We all screw up. And I think it's important that, you know, us high achievers leave that stuff in to just remind ourselves of different things that just happen in life. It's not a perfect, polished podcast. So, you know, I'm really excited today to talk with our guest, and I'll tell you about her in just a second. But we're talking about grief today. We're talking about, you know, sadness, loss, shifts in our world. Many of you who have followed my story know that in the pandemic, we went on the road as a family in a camper and road schooled the kids that at the time were in kindergarten and fourth grade. Left as a family of 4 and came back as a family of 3. Leaving my now ex-wife in California and coming back as an unexpected single dad responsible for these 2 lovely little girls. There's grief around that. There's sadness. There's, you know, hyper vigilance for me around not letting that happen again, and, you know, having my trauma sometimes lead at times. And that's stuff I work on with my therapist. And we all have different forms of grief, and I'm so excited to talk today. Today we're hanging out with Sarah Jaffe, who is a writer and reporter living in London. She's author of From the Ashes, Grief and Revolution in a World on Fire. Also author of Work Won't Love You Back, How Devotion to Our Jobs Keeps Us Exploited, Exhausted, and Alone, and Necessary Trouble, Americans in Revolt, all from bold type books. Her writing's been published in The Nation, The Washington Post, The Guardian, The New Republic, the New York Review of Books, and many other outlets. She's a columnist at The Progressive and a contributing writer at In These Times and co-host of the advice podcast, Heart Reacts. Sarah, welcome to the Practice podcast.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, man, you talked about work and then talk about grief. And I feel like also when I think about, you know, Writing Thursday is the New Friday, it came out in 2021, similar to when that book came out. Yeah. There's a lot of grief in the world. There's a lot of changes. There's a lot of political turmoil. And I mean, by the time this goes live, who knows what's going to be happening in the world in a couple months, you know? Yeah. So let's talk what grief is. Let's talk about how you went from work to grief.
Yeah, I actually wrote the proposal for Work Won't Love You Back in like the week after my father died back in 2018. Ooh. And so it was absolutely sort of the backdrop to my life when I was writing this book about work that was very focused on a certain way of understanding the labor of love. And I'm sure we'll get into that later. But it turns out that you can't just make your grief go away by working really hard. I should have known that from what I was writing, right? And it also meant that I started seeing grief in everything that I was sort of already reporting on. The people that I was talking to would tell me stories, and I was like, oh, this is grieving. This is something that felt really, 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 really under discussed in the world that we live in now, in the U.S. in particular, I think is quite bad at talking about grief, talking about painful things. We like to sort of change the subject and cheer up, and, you know, even a lot of the sort of grief discussions and grief reading offers you sort of ways to turn your grief into joy and all of these things. And I, you know, yeah. And so I was fascinated by the prevalence of this thing, this, like, I wouldn't even call it an emotion. It's like a combination of every emotion. Mm. And yet our complete inability to discuss it. And that's sort of shown up in the year of having this book out in the world. It's been kind of hard to get people to want to talk about it with me. So, so I wrote this book. It is a little bit of a memoir. It is mostly about the world and about how grief shows up in some of the major political forces and social forces of our time.
Yeah. Yeah. That tagline of grief and revolution in a world on fire.
Yeah.
So let's break that sentence down. We've got grief, we've got revolution, and we got world on fire. So talk a little bit about grief and kind of what you've observed. So you were saying we see it all over the place. I think traditionally, maybe therapists don't simplify this much, but I think the world, it's like, a father dies. It's, a marriage ends. It's, some sort of, traumatic event that happens to somebody. Yeah. How do you expand that definition of grief to go beyond kind of the typical grief that we think of?
Yeah, I think I was really surprised when my father died. I expected to be really sad, right? Like I'm going to be sad. That's a thing. I also kind of had this idea in my head that, I could get an A in grieving the way I got an A in everything else. Like, you made a joke about high achievers early on, and I was like, oh, I feel attacked,
Yeah, I'm attacking myself when I attack that.
Right. I'm like, a friend of mine sent me a meme a little while ago that was like, what is a former gifted child on Halloween that say like, what were you supposed to be? And you go, I was supposed to be a lot of things. But yeah, it turns out you can't get an A in grief, and you can't make it happen on a faster timeline, and you can't sort of work at it at all. And that, I think, is sort of the through line between these two books is I was sort of fascinated by like, okay, this thing isn't work. And it's not something that, in a lot of the discourse that we have around therapy these days is very much about like doing the work on yourself, right? I was literally talking about this with my therapist this morning and how like I find that all really frustrating, because the idea is that like if you are hurting, if you are sad, if you are traumatized, if you are suffering from something, you must have like insufficiently done the work. Mm-hmm. And I just found that like completely a useless framework when dealing with grief. Yeah. And the way that it would sort of come when it felt like it still does, right?
Oh, I'm sure.
7 years later, that you can't experience it on your timeline, but also if you don't make space for it to arrive when it does, it'll kick your ass in all sorts of like really intensely physical ways, right? You will get sick. You will wonder why you're having heart palpitations. You will all sorts of things that I experienced by pushing myself to work too hard while doing it, because people should do what I say and not what I do.
Now, you said that, there's not really a right way to do grief. Yeah. Like, what's the argument then for therapy or reading books about grief or like, I mean, there's got to be healthier ways and unhealthier ways, but maybe it's like kind of capitalistic, like we have achieved grief overcoming.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I the word revolution on the cover, it's obviously dramatic. I sort of didn't want it to say grief and politics because like, please kill me. That sounds terrible. Nobody wants to read that. But like the fact that like grief is such a rupture in your life, right? You're sort of not the same after as you were before. And I think therapy, I think counseling, I think friends who had experienced it were incredibly helpful for me in getting through that. God bless the therapist that I had, I eventually had been seeing for 12 years, who, was excellent at sort of making some of these points to me, right? Of saying like, it's not, and she would even say like, we don't have good therapeutic language for it a lot of the time either. It gets sort of filed under depression, but it's very different than depression, right? My experience of depression is like, I don't know why this has happened. My experience of grief is like, oh, I know what happened. I'm very aware of what happened. And like, I should be sad, right? These are things that should be affecting me. But what I didn't get was all the other parts of it that weren't just being sad. And so I think, understanding the way that this rupture in your personal life echoes these ruptures in the world, and how and again, these are the connections between Work Won't Love You Back in this book, how it's sort of disruptive to a capitalist system that, as you said, is like work really hard, get back to work, get your, go back to productivity. You get, maybe you get 3 days off for bereavement leave if you're lucky. And then you got to get back to work. And we don't talk about, the way that the world that we live in is killing us in all of these different fun ways, everything from, workplace disasters to climate catastrophe. So, if we, I think, could actually build a society that could talk about grief and loss and make space for it, I think it would actually be a healthier world to live in.
You said grief in politics a few times.
Yeah.
Take me into that word revolution and what grief in politics looks like.
Yeah, so the book has 5 main chapters, and they are about state violence, which is mostly seen through the lens of the movement for Black Lives and lately what's been happening in Gaza. The second chapter is about immigration and what people leave behind when they move across oceans, deserts, whatever, to find a better life or a safer life or escape something awful that happened where they were. I talked to people who had fled wars and climate disasters and everything in between. And the third chapter is about deindustrialization and what happens when the form of job that you had, not just like the job is gone, not just this one factory closes down, but like there's not another factory you can go get a job at. What happens when that goes away? The fourth chapter is about COVID, obviously, because I had this idea for this grief book and then COVID happened. And then the last chapter is about climate change. And you asked before we turned the recorder on where I was living. And I was actually living in New Orleans in the U.S. until about 3 weeks ago. And
I got to say, I love Jazz Fest.
New Orleans.
Coming down there.
New Orleans is a wonderful, wonderful place. And, we just passed the 20th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. Right. So like a lot of the time we talk about climate change as something that's in the future, that's coming 20, 30 years. It's going to affect our children, our grandchildren. But actually, 20 years ago, New Orleans was underwater. And 20 years ago today, New Orleans was still underwater. It's not just something that's happening in the future. It's happening now. It has been happening. It is something that people are already grieving losses from. And so in each of those segments, I talked to people who were active around these issues. I talked to people who were living through these kinds of losses and about what they would like to see different, what kinds of transformations would have made the thing that happened to them either A, not happen, or B, more bearable, right? The difference between fleeing your home because there's a flood and having somewhere to land where you are safe and welcomed and not treated as a burden, it wouldn't make losing your home not hurt, but it would make the whole thing a lot less miserable. Mm-hmm.
Tell me some of the stories that stand out to you from interviewing people. Yeah. I'm sure everyone has its own. It's like picking your favorite child. But like, what are some of them that stand out?
Yeah, the best part of my job is talking to people, and the fact that people trust me with these stories has always been, since I started doing journalism a million years ago, been really like meaningful to me. But this book was absolutely like the most intense thing because I'm talking to people about often the worst thing that ever happened to them. So one that I think about all the time is a man named Mohammed Mira, who is from Somalia, and he lives in Minneapolis. When I first talked to him, I interviewed him, during COVID, so probably winter of 2021, and he was working at an Amazon warehouse, and a lot of people in the Somali refugee community in Minneapolis had been recruited into these Amazon warehouses. And they actually did a bunch of really incredible organizing in those workplaces. And the company kind of thinks that they'll be easy to exploit because they're refugees and they should be grateful, right? But actually, they brought this incredible community tradition of supporting each other and standing up for their rights. And the thing that they had first fought Amazon over was actually prayer time, right? Of being able to get the time to pray on their schedule. They're observant Muslims. and got Amazon to sort of come to the table and agree to give them that, which I think is an incredible story. And then by the time...
I want to ask you a little bit about that.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, what did that community organizing look like? Because, I mean, when I think about taking on Amazon, I think you just get squashed. So, like,
yeah, exactly.
You know, like, what did that community organizing look like when they actually did that?
Yeah, I think one of the things, you know, we've seen in the last few years, people like successfully, at least one time, you know, win a union election at Amazon in Staten Island and New York. But Amazon has just not bargained with them, right? It has just continued to behave as though that union didn't exist. And so what the workers in Minneapolis did, and they were members of an organization called the Awood Center, which is a community and worker center in the Somali and East African community. They just acted like a union without worrying about winning an election. And so that meant that they went on strike. If somebody got fired, they would all walk out, right? That they would stand up for each other and act together in that place, make demands together as a community without waiting for there to be an official bargaining process. So they used a lot of direct action. They used a lot of building support through the broader community, not just in the Somali community, but also in the city of Minneapolis, which has a sort of incredible labor movement. And they, you know, they picked an issue that at the time anyway, you know, now all the tech companies are on board with Trump, and they don't really, you know, they would love to crush a bunch of observant Muslims asking for time to pray on the work calendar, right? But in this point in time, that Amazon wanted to look like a progressive company, and they wanted to look like good guys, and so, oh yes, of course, we'll bargain with them, although they wouldn't call it bargaining. And so they picked issues that would sort of make Amazon's public image suffer if they were real jerks about it, which they still were real jerks about it, but like, they managed to negotiate in that way. And like, look, Amazon has tried to crush them. It closed one of the warehouses in Minneapolis and sort of dispersed these workers to different places or fired them. So it's still a really, really uphill battle. But, you know, I was fascinated by the stories that he had, that Mohammed had, and some of these other workers had, of coming to the U.S., right? Of leaving Somalia. He had left Somalia in like 1991 and moved, you know, on foot across a lot of Africa, and then ended up in Nashville for a while, and then in Minneapolis. And he, when we last spoke, he was actually driving for Uber, so one tech giant to another, and his wife and children had actually moved back to Somalia, and he was working still in Minneapolis to pay for the kids to go to private school because, like, you know, the state, such as it is in Somalia, does not have a lot of infrastructure that functions. But, you know, the story we hear a lot about people who immigrate to the U.S. is like, oh, they're so grateful. It's so wonderful here. It's so much better. And I thought it was a fascinating story that actually, like, nah, man, they would have loved to stay where they were. And they did, in fact, go back, you know, and they went back because that was important to them. And the reason that he had ended up in the U.S. in the first place was, you know, I mean, you can watch the movie Black Hawk Down and see what happened in Somalia and the role that the U.S. military played there, right? These are not surprising things, you know. Somalia is one of the places that we have, you know, droned a whole bunch in the last 20 years. So this sense of loss that is really not acknowledged for people who, you know, in these countries that we see as sort of net receivers of migrants. I'm in the UK right now, so the same sort of thing applies here, right? And it's just like, oh, these people really love to be here because it's so great here. And it's like, no, a lot of people are fleeing things that they had no control over and would have preferred to stay put if they could.
Yeah, yeah. I want to thank Headway for sponsoring this episode. If you run a group practice, you know that accepting insurance can be overwhelming. Between credentialing, billing, and payroll, the admin side can easily take over your week. Headway was built to help you handle this, and they're the only platform designed specifically for in-network group practices. Whether you're growing your team or running an established practice, Headway makes the business side easier with faster credentialing, higher per session rates, and bi-weekly payments your team can count on. They work with therapy, psychiatric, and hybrid group practices. There are no subscription fees, just the support you need to run your practice with ease. Run your best group practice with Headway, trusted by thousands of group practice leaders to simplify insurance admin and reach more people through in-network care. Curious how Headway can work for you? Head to join.headway.co/Joe. That's join.headway.co/Joe to learn more. There's so many different ways to think about Muhammad. Like, one way I think about his story is that deep sense of community where they don't wait for permission with a union.
Yeah.
And then I go to, like, is that because there's just such a deep cultural connection that typical WASP society doesn't have, that we don't have that unifying, like, is it even possible to take that lesson and say, God, can I have enough potlucks in my community to make it that we would support each other in that? Like, I
think there are ways to build that, but it is true, right? We are in this really isolated space, right? I live alone in this apartment building. I vaguely know my neighbors. One of them helped me carry a box up the stairs the other day. They're generally nice people. But it's not a, close thing. But then the place I was living in New Orleans, I'm actually really sad to have lost this because I lived in a little apartment and just this small building with a courtyard. There were 6 apartments in the building. And my neighbors were all really lovely, and we would sort of hang out in the courtyard together. And, it's warm 9 months out of the year. So we had a lot of time to sit in the courtyard and drink wine and get to know each other. And, I talk a lot to people who are doing housing organizing. There's actually a great story from housing organizers, also in Minneapolis in that book too, where they are building community across buildings. When you're talking about tenants in, big rental buildings, they're building community across the city. This organization in Minneapolis, my Spanish accent is terrible, so please pardon me. But it's Inquilinos Unidos, and that means Tenants United. And they have actually created a housing cooperative. And this was a long fight against this corporate landlord, and the city of Minneapolis, or the state, licenses landlords. So you actually have to be approved to do that. And this landlord lost his license because they got together and they found all of these, horrible violations of basic safety in these buildings. And they managed to buy a couple of the buildings and build this housing cooperative. And if you go to the neighborhood where these buildings are, and there are a few of them on a couple of different streets, they have these huge murals out front. So everybody in the neighborhood can see which buildings are in the cooperative. So it sort of symbolizes this community that you can see that people built, and they built across difference, right? You have people who are immigrants from various places. You have people who are born in the U.S. You have people who are students who are sort of living in student housing, and landlords think they can take advantage of students. And so the connections, it is really possible to build those, but we definitely live in a society that has made them much, much harder to build. And sorry, there's a motorcycle going by outside here.
Oh, you're in the big city.
Yeah, I'm in London.
You might hear a squirrel outside for me.
Yeah, and the one of the last bits that I used for my interview with Muhammad, he was telling me about his family in Somalia, and he was like, we don't have a word mine in the U.S. Everybody is mine. This is mine.
Oh wow.
He's like, we share everything. We don't, if you came to my house, we would feed you, we would house you. We would never for a second think of not welcoming you in because we don't have that word mine in the same way. So, yes, absolutely. There are cultural differences, but also we can learn from that too, Again, the way that we sort of shut ourselves off from learning from people who have come to the US because this lens of sort of either sort of pity, oh, it's so hard for them, or the racist attacks that a lot of people have faced in recent years, especially. Neither of those see people as full humans who have a lot to teach us. And the question of sort of right? Individualized therapy is wonderful and I love it and I wouldn't still be here without it. But also, like, what does it look like to build other structures for taking care of each other into our communities? And this was a thing that I sort of came away from reporting this book thinking about a lot. Like, how do we build spaces to grieve together? How do we build spaces to celebrate together? How do we make those the same space? You know, it's easy to go to the pub to celebrate a good time, but it's not the same. We don't have the same set of practices and understandings for how to support people who are going through something like a loss.
Earlier, you said that as you kind of heard these stories, as you interviewed people, that kind of collectively, there were transformations that needed to happen that people would say, like, I wish this could happen. What are some of those transformations that are kind of lessons from these interviews that to you wish would be enacted more, either politically, personally, just, you know, within small groups in society?
Yeah, I think, you know, one of the conclusions I end up writing in this book is like, look, we're all going to die. Sorry to Peter Thiel and the rest of them that think they're going to solve death, but like, we're all going to die. Even in a perfect utopia, we would still lose people and things. We will still experience grief. But there are all of these forms of sort of horrifying loss that we're, you know, watching on the news, that some of us are experiencing in our neighborhoods, that really don't have to happen that way. You know, Hurricane Katrina was something we couldn't control. Like, even well before climate change, there were still really bad hurricanes, right? But the way that the city was kind of abandoned to its fate, we could have changed, right? And that is just happening in hyperspeed now, right? I was writing an article about the 20th anniversary of Katrina, and had just been a letter from a bunch of employees at FEMA saying that, like, the recommendations that were passed in the wake of Katrina so that this thing didn't happen again have either never been implemented, some of them, or if they have been implemented, are being rolled back right now. And the agency is being slashed, people are being fired. Elon Musk and his Doge boys got rid of everybody, or everybody that they could. And so we don't have, you lose that sort of institutional record of learning from the thing when you fire everybody, you know? And also, we just literally haven't invested in what it would take to evacuate a city of that size, or a bigger one, right? New Orleans is not a very big city. It's less than 1 million people, like a good bit less at this point. What would it take to evacuate Dallas, right? I was living in New York when Hurricane Sandy happened. What would that look like? You know, these things that are real considerations, we're not doing those. Instead, we're building data centers that are using all the fresh water in Memphis or something, you know? And so we're, if anything, sort of going in the opposite direction from a society that would actually care about people's needs. And instead, we're building, mega data centers for AI bots to, I don't know what, plagiarize my books. Just had to sign up on the Anthrop settlement. Have you done this, Joe? Make sure you get your Anthropic money if they used your book in the AI training.
I'll write that down. I don't believe I signed that. I know my agent sent me something to sign or something. And so,
give you your contact info in case your book was in there. They might owe us a little bit of money. Probably won't be enough, but that's fine.
No, never is.
Take what we can get.
Seriously.
Yeah. And so, I talk to people about everything from like, what could Amazon do to, again, make life more livable for the workers who work there. Some of that is really basic stuff like give them a raise and paid sick days. Some of it was prayer time. And then some of it is like, how do we rearrange a society that actually cares about human life and death? What do we do when deindustrialization is a fact? And that even if we build more factories in the US instead of data centers, they still don't require as many people to work there. And so this is, how do we think about where people find meaning? And again, this is yet another connection back to Work Won't Love You Back, right? That like, what would it look like? And again, I'm talking to an audience of therapists, right? What would it look like to have a world that invested more in making sure that everybody, and not just the people who can afford it, could get good mental health care. Like it would be different universe, you know? And that's something that like we could do, right? We have resources to do that. We have probably lots of people who would love to do that kind of caring work rather than, you know, bagging groceries or whatever, you know, working in an automobile battery plant. But we're not doing it. Why? You know?
Yeah. Oh, if only we had the time to answer that, solve it, and submit that to Congress.
Yeah, right.
Well,
Excuse
Sarah,
me, therapy for
I
all,
feel like
Bill.
we could. Yeah, I think we could just go on and on, have so many podcast episodes. I hope you'll come back on the show. Yeah. You're welcome back anytime. The final question I always ask is, if every private practitioner in the world were listening right now, what would you want them to know?
Oh man, I mean, let's you know, write a bill for therapy for all at this point. I think, okay, on a serious note though, because I've been talking about the collective and the community, is like, what more can we do to not isolate the care people are getting so much, and to think about how do we build community around, you know, around taking care of people's grief, taking care of people's trauma, taking care of people's loss. And do that in a way that, you know, that also provides more support for all of you, the providers, right? Because I think we're all so isolated.
Well, where can people get your books?
You can get them wherever good books are sold, hopefully. You can order directly from the internet on bookshop.org, since I've been slagging off Amazon for the last hour. You can order them from your local bookstore. We love to tell people to go to their local independent bookstores. And basically wherever you get books.
So amazing. We'll put links to all that in the show notes. Sarah, thank you so much for being on the Practice of the Practice podcast.
Thank you.
You know, I think that one thing that stands out to me about what Sarah just said is just thinking about hearing other people's stories. You know, in Thursday is the New Friday, I talk about the research behind an outsider perspective and how outsiders statistically actually have more influence over organizations than insiders. You think about when you join a new job and you see all the things that they think are normal, but they're actually not. You actually have more influence. And putting yourself in situations where you get to know people outside of your community that are immigrants from other countries that think differently, they don't even have the word for mine, is such a jewel Sarah gets to just personally have and then shares with us through her books and through podcasts like this. So I want to encourage you to just find those areas that make you a little nervous, that make you feel like talking to a stranger maybe could be the difference between you learning about the word mine in our culture and the lack of it in someone else's. To have that conversation with an Uber driver, to dig in and to try to get to know people on a different level than maybe how you have already within the bubble that you live in. You know, we couldn't do this show without our sponsors, and Headway has come on as such an amazing sponsor. They're also helping co-host the 7-figure practice retreat that we're putting on in the Dominican Republic, an all-inclusive resort. If you haven't applied for that, you got to head on over to practicethepractice.com/7. Use the number or write it out. It'll take you to the same place. But Headway helps you run the best group practice that you can, trusted by thousands of group practice leaders to simplify insurance administration and reach more people through in-network care. If you're curious how Headway can work for you, head on over to join.headway.co/Joe. That's join.headway.co/Joe. Thank you so much for letting me into your ears and into your brain. Have a great day. I'll talk to you soon. Special thanks to the band Silence is Sexy for that intro music, and this podcast is designed to provide accurate and authoritative information in regard to the subject matter covered. It is given with the understanding that neither the host, the producers, the publishers, or guests are rendering legal, accounting, clinical, or other professional information. If you want a professional, you should find one.